I was a high school English and journalism teacher, and I began to ask a lot of questions about why the school board was doing this or doing that, or why they didn't come out and see what we were actually doing in the classrooms. And I would get a lot of publicity for my high school journalism class and the school I was in. And one day they sort of said, "Well, why can't you do some of this for all the schools?" And then I took a year off and went back to the University of Missouri to get my master's degree, and audited a course in school public relations, which I thought was really interesting because I was very interested in how we could influence how people felt about their schools, whether they worked in the schools or whether they were parents or citizens of the community. And I ended up writing my thesis on that subject, organizing a program of school public relations for the Santa Barbara, California school districts. And unbeknownst to me, my professor sent it to my superintendent and said, "Thought you would be interested in this." And on the morning I was going to take my master's comps, the superintendent called and said, "I just want to tell you that I've read your thesis, and instead of having you head the English department at the new high school," my heart sort of sunk at that moment because every English teacher dreams of heading a new English department at a new high school. He said, "We are going to bring you into the central office and let you implement this plan that you've written out." So in many ways, it was a dream come true. I was a one-person operation, so I was very dependent on collaborating with everyone. And we were able to get a program going that was very, very good. We were able to accomplish a lot of things that the school district wanted to accomplish. Well, I got recruited away from Santa Barbara by the Los Angeles County Office of Education to come in and help them establish a program in public relations for the 95 school districts of Los Angeles County. It was, I'd gotten active in the National School Public Relations Association, and I also had attended several PRSA meetings in Santa Barbara. So I was getting to be more of a professional with my own network, and at the time, Bob Oles, which is a name that I'm sure people could think about, but he used to have there was an office that PRSA helped with that was established in Santa Barbara, and they conducted workshops and training sessions for people on the West Coast, and he was one of the great pioneers of public relations as well. And so at any rate, I was able to do a lot of networking, and in Los Angeles, it was a very exciting time to be the head of public relations for Los Angeles County, because it was the time of mandated court order desegregation, and then a couple of years later mandated collective bargaining, which was a whole new challenge for schools. And then a couple of years after that, the kind of decline in student enrollment that meant that school districts had to close high schools and make all sorts of adjustments. And if you've never had to close a high school, you have no idea how challenging it can be, because the Band Boosters Club is really powerful. They can almost start a school board recall. And everyone, of course, has a stake in it. They don't want their child's school closed. But it was that kind of experience that made it so that I was on an airplane flying back to speak to the Minnesota School Boards Association, and sat next to a man who worked for Munsingware. And Munsingware, so he was very interested in what I did, and he couldn't believe schools had PR people. And so then he said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I help school districts close schools and deal with union issues and everything." And he said, "That's really interesting, because we need to close about 5 or 6 of our plants in the United States. Do you think what would you recommend we do?" And I said, "Well, I think public relations is pretty much the same no matter where you practice it. So here's what I would do. Here's what we did to close a high school in a community." Well, after I got back to California, I got a phone call from the folks at Munsingware saying, "Would you come back and meet with us and help us plan this?" And I came back and talked to them about it, and then they said to me, would you come on a leave of absence and help us actually do this? And at the time I thought, well, this would be fun to do. So I took a leave from my job in LA County and decided I would spend from May to November in Minnesota and ended up falling in love with Minnesota. And so then they said, no, you can't go back, you have to stay. So I stayed in Minnesota and helped Munsingware close their plants all over the United States, many plants, and then got recruited by Dayton Hudson to head their public relations program. But Patrick Jackson was a very vital part of all those decisions I made along the way, because he was, I met him when he was the president of PRSA, and I was the president of NSPRA, the National School Public Relations Association. Patrick convened a group of the presidents of all the public relations organizations, the Canadian Public Relations Organization, Wiki, IABC. I think Florida had its own public relations group at the time. There were probably 7 or 8 of us, and we talked about what we could share that would make our leadership of these organizations more effective. Things like who are really good speakers and who are the speakers to avoid at conferences. We talked about the importance of a code of ethics and accreditation, and why couldn't, because we saw the opportunity for a lot of movement between the different public relations organizations, why couldn't there be a common code of ethics or a common accreditation that other organizations would honor? So that was the formation of what is known as the North American Public Relations Council, which now has a common code of ethics, which is wonderful. But so Patrick was really instrumental in helping guide my career, and I was just a huge influence. When I got the opportunity to go and work in the corporate world, I called Patrick and said, well, what do you think? I mean, I'm a school PR person. And he said, no, you have to do it. You have to do it. You've always been a pioneer, so you have to do it. You can do it. And so I called him on occasion and say, oh my gosh, here's what I'm facing. But he was always just a wonderful, wonderful counselor for me. Well, I got recruited by Dayton Hudson. Dayton Hudson Corporation was one of the 3 largest retailers in America. You know what today is Target Stores Corporation. And then I retired from Dayton Hudson. I promised myself I would retire because I had always worked when I turned 60. And so that I did. And then people began calling and saying, oh, well, won't you do this project for us, or won't you do this project for us? And so I ended up taking on all kinds of little clients, some of them sort of big. But at any rate, I got tired of I thought, I don't really like this working at home. And I was always going to Kinko's, to copy things. And one day, John Graham, the CEO of Fleishman Hillard, called me. And I knew him through the Page Society and the seminar and several groups. He called and said, I want to put a flag up in Minnesota. And would you be willing to come and join me in doing that? And I said to him, you don't want me. I really don't like agencies. I seldom ever use them. The one exception was Kexton Company in New York, which I really liked because they were small and you always got the principals. So he said, well, what do I have to do to talk you into it? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't really. Finally, I said to him, if you let me start an office that I would have hired, then I'm interested. And so that was sort of what I was assigned to do. And I put together a group of 6 or 7 people, all of whom who had worked in companies. And so that I figured we had to be unique, and we had to be very Minnesota, because no other international public relations agency had ever succeeded in staying there. They would come and spend a year or 2 and then they'd go away. And because it's very much, Minnesota likes to do business with Minnesota people. And so we established an office, and it's now been there 20 years. And we built it to be third largest in the Twin Cities in terms of revenues, and then I thought it was time to retire again. So I did. But it's fun that it's still there, and I still can help steer business their direction. So, well, I'm on several boards, and then I stay really busy. One of my big passions is a group called Women Winning, and I helped rebrand the name of the organization, because it used to be known as the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund, but there were a lot of Minnesota Women's this, Minnesota Women's that, and we had to stand out for what we did. And what we did was raise money to help women win. And so I like raising money. I like helping recruit women to run for office and help train them and to be successful campaigners. We know that when women run, women win. And so that's been a really great achievement. We now have 4 Native American women legislators in Minnesota. We endorsed last year about 70 candidates, and this is at all levels: school board, city council, park boards, as well as legislative and senatorial and governor, and we endorsed Hillary Clinton. Of that number that we endorsed last year, more than half were successful. So we're helping grow the number of women leading in government. So I like that. That's really exciting for me. And then I have 11 grandchildren now. So being a grandma takes a little time. I like having standards that are spelled out. It's a nice go-to, but it's also, I think it sets us apart as professionals. So when I was accredited, I got a copy of the PRSA Code of Ethics, which was sent to me with my certificates of membership and all. And I framed it and put it on the wall in my office. And people come in, and if you're on the phone, they look around in your office and all, and they'd say, "What is this Code of Ethics thing?" And I said, "Those are the standards that guide me as a professional." And I used to love to point them out to people. And then I was in one of the early classes of non-telephone people to be asked to join the Page Society. In fact, Larry Foster was one of the people who called me and said, "Oh, Ann, you have to do this." But the Page principles then were ones that I really identified with, because they were very corporate. Tell the truth, prove it with action. All support exists. A business thrives when the public supports it. And that was what we knew through retail, that business is good when we serve communities, and communities are feeling good about our business. So it fit with what I was, and I do think those standards. And then Flushman Hillard had on its nameplate, it has you would see my name, and on the back I saw the Flushman Hillard philosophy. And so it would be, how important our customers are, and how important it is to be collaborative and to work with other offices. And the final one was always that we only operate with the highest ethical standards. So I think those are sort of the guideposts that make us all stand a little taller and feel a little better about what we do. And I must admit that there are times when I was challenged with something, and I sort of looked at those my Code of Ethics and the Page principles, and it helped me sort of decide I have to speak up. I have to say no, that we can't do it that way. And so I do think that those are important guideposts to help us as professionals. Yes, I did. That was quite a while ago. I was asked to do a speech for a conference in Minnesota for women in business. And I thought, well, I need to ask people. So I sent a letter to 100 women that I respected and that I thought were good leaders all over the country, and told them I was going to give a speech. And I said, would you be willing to answer 4 questions for me? And they were things like, what do you think are the best qualities of a leader? What have you been most challenged in doing? What are your recommendations about leadership? But anyway, and then I put them all together, and so I sort of reported the findings of my study. And I can't recall them now. You'd have to I'm sorry. But at any rate, it was very interesting, and in terms of the kinds of leadership that women feel, that the leadership skills that women feel were important, and the collegiality with other women leaders, women supporting other women. And it was interesting how many women of my age, there were no women mentors. I mean, I only had men mentor me as I was growing up because there were no other women. I was the first woman elected to the Dayton-Hudson Management Committee, and so people would say, "What's it like?" And I would say, "Well, I'm the only one who doesn't have to stand in line at the bathroom break, you know." So, but and sometimes it would be frustrating when you would be sitting and you'd make a suggestion at a table, and people would sort of nod politely in your direction. You have to go back. Think back. This is in the early '80s, and people would sort of nod, and then some man sitting down the table would make the same suggestion, and people would go, "Oh," you know. So you had to learn, you know. So I learned that that whenever I introduced a new thought, I would always say, "You know, a lot of us have been talking about this, but but now, of course, it's much different." And but I do think those were interesting times to be in management. Well, having joined the Page Society when there were only about 9 women members, and I think at one point there were really a dozen in those early years, and now seeing the membership has grown considerably. I think that we just have to keep helping other women move forward. And I have no doubt that women are every bit as skilled. I think that the C-suite often doesn't see women as at that level. Someone told me once that women would find it would be recognized easier when the men at the top, meaning the CEO of the company or the CFO or the CAO, when those men were an age that knew women as equals. That the men leading corporations when I started out knew women as secretaries, sisters, mothers, friends, but not as business equals. And I was lucky because I had a CEO that really that really respected you for what you knew, and so I got a lot of great boosts along the way from him. So I think that kind of, we're going to see some changes as we see leadership at the top that knows that's sort of been co-equals with women in other roles. I think that's why school districts have done well, because there are a lot of women leaders in the schools, superintendents, principals, leadership in schools, and maybe it's because there were always more women teachers, or women were I don't know, braver about speaking up or taking on assignments to help kids.
Do you think that leader?
Yes. Well, I think leadership experiences maybe would be sort of like if you want to be a school teacher, you have to take a course in student teaching, and that is probably the best course you will take because you're actually interacting with. So if students in the public relations sequence could have a course where they shadowed a leader, or where they and Patrick Jackson and I now you have to go back again to the 80s, but we used to try to talk with professors about, could we get professors as interns in business, and could we get them to come in and spend a summer as an intern where they could get more exposure to the leadership opportunities and challenges, so that then they could teach that more effectively. And we got a few takers, but it was one of those things that was sort of hindered by the expense connected with it, because it would mean a professor in North Carolina would come to Minnesota, and so how do you have to put them up and give them a per diem or something like that. So, and it was, but we liked thinking that way. I do think, though, that leadership is something you learn by experience. I don't think it's something you can just teach. Marilyn, well, again, there were just a small group of women. Joyce Hergenhan was at GE, and Marilyn at AT&T, and so we would always gather together at the meetings. And Marilyn, of course, was very inclusive. She was a gatherer, and we shared a lot. And I think one of the beauties of Page was that it was actually, it's true of any professional organization. When you build that network of other professionals, you can pick up the phone and call and ask for help. But with Paige, it was very special. And I was in the seminar with Marilyn too, so I got to know her quite well there. After she had led AT&T through the Planned Parenthood issues, the boycott and the shareholder meeting disruptions and things like that, Dayton Hudson found itself in the same kind of pickle. And it was over a grant we made to Planned Parenthood in Minnesota. Not a grant nationally, but a grant made in Minnesota. And so of course my CEO said to me, "What are we going to do about this, Barkelew?" So I went to my office and I picked up the phone and I called Marilyn. And I left a message with her secretary because she was in a meeting. And I said, "Would you just tell her that I called and that I'm facing a Planned Parenthood issue, and I want her to go back and walk me through what happened and how she dealt with it." She called me within half an hour. We spent another half an hour on the phone, and I was able to, before the end of the day, step forward and offer suggestions and recommendations to my management team about how we should move forward with this challenge for us. And so I think Marilyn was always very inclusive. And then we would go to meetings and she would say to 4 or 5 of us, can we meet together during the break? I have a challenge I want to ask you about." And I remember sitting around a table with her talking about the challenge AT&T was facing with a publication in South Africa where they had inadvertently included a word they shouldn't have included, or a photo, I guess it was. And how do you deal with that internally in an organization? So she made us all think. And I think being inclusive like that and being willing to share experiences was a hallmark of hers that helped teach all of us. We had our own role models in each other. And we learned from each other. And that's still true today. I mean, I attended a women's meeting yesterday where there was all this incredible sharing of how do we create our own space and how can we help others and what kind of challenges do we continue to run into. And there were some young recent college graduates in the group, and it was the one distressing moment was when you hear a young woman who has just gotten a graduate degree from a premier university talking about the kind of roadblocks she's running into as a young woman. And you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I thought we left all that behind. But we haven't. So there's still a lot of work, a lot of challenges that we need to really address and step forward and help these young women as they move forward in organizations. Well, of course, I just always felt like my PRSA code of ethics was my guidepost. So, and the fact that there's a common code of ethics for professional organization people, I think that's a great step forward. I served for many years on the Minnesota News Council, and this was a council that was set up to be a step before legal action, so that if you were misrepresented in a news story, you could, lots of people would say, well, we're going to sue. Well, litigation isn't always the answer for something like that. And what is the old saying? You don't argue with people that by ink by the barrel and paper by the ton, whatever. At any rate, so the Minnesota News Council was set up to be a hearing panel, and it was made up of half citizens and half media people. And so you would bring your complaint to the Minnesota News Council, and then the media that you were complaining about would be represented to try to tell their viewpoint about why they covered something the way they did. And then you were able to, as a group, then you made a decision. You either endorsed it or you said to the media, you shouldn't have done it that way. And everyone participated in it. All the media would come if there was a complaint filed against them. 60 Minutes did a big story on the Minnesota News Council when Northwest Airlines filed a complaint against the CBS-owned television station in Minnesota, and about how they had covered safety issues on their airplanes. And Northwest Airlines, which is known, of course, today as Delta, their complaint was that every time there was an image on the screen, it was of a plane going down. And they stood outside a fence, so that you were looking through a chain link fence at the airplanes, so that everything was suggesting more negativity than needed to be. And of course but those kinds of things. So it was on the council, we would say, when a reporter would be questioned about how they'd covered something, we would say, what are the standards of your paper in terms of what is your requirement? What do you promise your readers or your viewers that you are going to do in terms of ethical honesty and reporting? And I always loved to ask that question because I knew that as a public relations professional I had ethics, that I had a code of ethics that helped guide me. Very few media people had those kinds of standards. I mean, the journalism organizations didn't even have standards that their paper would require. But it did have a lot of media folks say, no, this is what we stand for. We require reporters to check sources. The Duluth, Minnesota newspaper had after a complaint was filed where a story appeared on page 1, but the response of the accuser had made an accusation about a company, and the company response didn't appear till the jump of the story. So for people that don't read the jump, why then all they read was this this tweet that was just a short piece on the front page. And at the end of the hearing, the editor of the paper said, we are going to institute a policy today that says that we will always, on a front page, we will always include both sides. So that was a major accomplishment. But you need that kind of thing to make people look at what are their standards for how they're reporting news. Now, of course, the social media today, you're never going to have that kind of ability to have standards. That now we have to look at what are the standards that you as a consumer will impose on what you see. I read an article just last week or earlier this week where it was talking about the number of high school journalism teachers across the country that are now teaching students how to identify fake news and what motivates it. And then a little farther down in the article, it said that the California legislature someone has introduced a bill in the legislature in California requiring that every junior and senior high school student have a unit on fake news. Now, this is amazing, but it does say people are willing to do something about it, that they're not, and I admire the journalism teachers for being on top of it. And they're very, very much in the moment talking to their kids about what they're seeing on television or reading about. Hopefully they're all still reading newspapers, but whether they read them online or whatever. But that kind of being on top of it, I think, is going to help educate the next generation. The way we used to do newspapers in the classroom, where you bring them in so that you sort of trained kids how to read papers and how to know what was good news or news, fair reporting. And so maybe this kind of movement is a good one, but I'm fascinated that California would make it a requirement. Well, and if you're going to cover a sporting event, let's say, and you don't want to stay clear to the end of the game, you could always go back and write a story and then fill in the end score. But I think all this kind of thing gives journalism teachers a whole new opportunity. Hope there are more and more of them around.
We need them.
Yes, we do need them. Well, when we developed the College of Fellows and PRSA, it was a big gathering of people that talked about accreditation and then the establishment of the College of Fellows and whether we should call ourselves public relations professionals or corporate communications professionals. And so Eddie Bernays got into the mix here. Patrick Jackson and Edward Bernays and the whole group. And as a result, I got to meet him. And I was going to Boston once but I really wanted the chance to meet him in person, personally. So I said to Patrick Jackson, I'm coming out to Boston to work with one of our companies. I think we were going to do an annual report shoot. And I said, is there any chance that you could come in and we could take Eddie Bernays to dinner? And he said, well, I'm working with a client, but he said, I think you should go ahead and have dinner with Edward Bernays. So I thought, well, this is wonderful. Well, I was told when I landed at the airport to go to his home, and I was prepared then to take him out to dinner. And I arrived at his house with my suitcase, and he said, oh, good, you've come to spend the night. And I said, no, I'm just here. I want to take you to dinner. I thought that was what Patrick had arranged. He said, no, I'm going to fix you dinner. And so we went into the kitchen, and he gave me my choice of 2 or 3 different kinds of lean cuisine. And we fixed the lean cuisine, and we had a glass of wine and sat and visited and talked about public relations, and it was just incredible. I sort of left there thinking, oh my gosh, I just spent an evening with one of the founders of this profession we share. And he was so generous and so kind. And then I invited him to come and speak to our Minnesota PRSA chapter. And he came. And I wanted him to meet my team at Dayton-Hudson. So I picked him up and I brought him over, and we were walking down the hall, and we passed the general counsel of Dayton-Hudson. And so I introduced the 2 of them. And I said who Edward Bernays was, and then I introduced the general counsel and said he's the general counsel. And Edward Bernays said, oh, well, you must work for Anne. And made my day. And the general counsel was sort of taken aback. And Edward Bernays said, because she's in charge of the court of public opinion. And it was such a special moment.